It's my great pleasure to introduce Clare Lockhart here. Clare and I met in 2008 when she presented her book on fixing failed states. And it changed the way we look at conflict and social sciences. It did for me, at least. And when I talked to Clare, we talked about education right away. And she was saying, well, I think in my next life, I will be focusing on capacity building and issues of education. So this is 2015. I'm so glad Clare is here. Clare is the co-founder and director of the Institute for State Effectiveness, which works in a range of countries aiming to make transitions out of fragility. She's the co-author, as I said, of Fixing Failed States in 2008, and she's authored and co-authored numerous articles on security and institution building. Clare was selected as the Young Global Leader in 2011 and as chair of the Fragile States Council in 2011-2012 for the World Economic Forum. She serves on a number of boards that make me feel ashamed of the few I serve on. They include the Asia Foundation, Solar Afghanistan, the Women's Regional Network for South Asia, Equality for Peace and Democracy, and the Developmental Leadership Program. She is a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale, and also serves on several task forces related to security and development. So it is really my great pleasure to introduce Clare. Please welcome Clare.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and I must say it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really thrilled to see this initiative going forward and applying all the principles of learning organizations to what you're going to be doing. Well, thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to put the issue of education in a larger context and think about its relationships to the task of overcoming fragility and how countries can get through transitions and transformations successfully by way of background. And as Yolande introduced, ISE, the organization I co-founded with Dr. Ghani, and our organization owes him a huge debt intellectually and in leadership, and of course he's now gone on to other responsibilities. But we've looked both at countries that are in crisis and are grappling with transitions and transformations, but we've also spend at least half of our time looking at countries that have transformed successfully to try and apply lessons from how countries have tackled those challenges. And we certainly draw enormous hope and confidence from the large numbers of cities, of regions, of countries that have successfully navigated those transitions within the last three or four decades. Of the countries that are listed as the focus, we work in 5 of the 6. In Afghanistan, which is my own deepest experience, I take great heart from a USAID program back in the 60s and 70s to give scholarships at American University Beirut. Not only gave Dr. Ghani his educational breakthrough that enabled him to go on and get PhDs and become a social scientist, but a large number of others. I think of a cohort of 20, at least half of them have served in leadership and other public service positions in the last decade. So I've seen firsthand the way that this educational investment creates the foundation in decades to come in ways that may not be immediately measurable. And then probably one of my favorite board positions at the moment is serving on the board of SOLAR, which many of you may be familiar with. It's a small boarding school, but even investing in 30 to 40 girls, what kind of leadership are you creating for the future? In Haiti, we've been studying the country over the years, and most recently looking at, after the earthquake, we all promised to build back better, but 4 years, 5 years on, is that really the case? And even when we really try to do things right, are we doing it? So what more lessons do we need to learn and apply? And I think the challenge, the sort of next chapter for Haiti is very much on the table and provides an enormous both challenge and opportunity to improve even further what we collectively can bring to the table from the outside. I've just come now from meeting with a minister who's from the north in Nigeria to reflect on the very real challenges in Nigeria. And again, she puts this education and social inclusion of the next generation, and not making false promises or empty promises, but making real promises that can be delivered to the communities at the center. And getting down to the basics. Does one need a citizenship charter where every village knows that it may take a while to improve social services, but at the end of a 5 or 10 year period, will they receive a sort of package of basic services at the core of which is going to be access to education? And Pakistan and South Sudan, we've been involved with in different ways over the years. We look more broadly at fragile post-conflict states. We've looked at, when Dr. Ghani and I wrote the book, Fixing Failed States, he wanted to call that for citizens, because the central thesis is that it's putting the citizen at the center of the endeavor of rebuilding public service. And how do we always have in mind that citizen as the user, as the ultimate beneficiary, and seeing the world through their eyes? We looked at 10 different functions or factors of governance. Never were they intended to be central functions. It's a question of at what level should the service be provided, what functions provided it, a capital city level, a regional level, an urban level, a district or a village, and how do you align the system? I'll come back to that topic. But I think probably most foundational of all we've come to learn is the human capital function and the investment in the next generation. Moving to, I may be doing this wrong. So education really is the foundation for the future. And this, I'm really stating the very basics here that we all know. Education is the route to jobs, but also equipping the citizens to lay the foundations for their country's rebuilding, both the public and the private sector. And, even the more important now, especially in post-conflict or fragile countries where you do, in some contexts, have a lost generation who missed out on education altogether. But the added challenge, but we'd say also opportunity of the youth bulge. We're hearing again and again, I think the demographic statistics are getting better, but the statistic we keep hearing is 65 or 70% of the population under 25 in this group of countries, in a number of countries, so growing populations, education systems already under stress are going to need to cater to increasing populations at a time when security is not a given. So enormous challenges, but also an opportunity if this next generation, if they can see routes to inclusion, and it starts with education, as you all know, then we'll be laying the foundation for stability in the future. I'm going to start with challenges, move to opportunities, and reflect on some of the dilemmas. And having listened into your morning, I approach this with all humility that I'm not a professional education expert. My specialty is transitions, transformations more generally. So all acknowledge that the expertise is in the room, and I was very encouraged to hear some of the themes you were talking on. I'll reflect on some of them, but seek to put it in this broader context. Some of the particular challenges, and you've been discussing them, I think it's embedded in this program, is ensuring access to all students. And I think we all know, and particularly when in conflict dynamics, where the trust between communities, whether those communities are separated by geographic or religious or political or other divides, the trust between communities that another community is getting more access than the other community is very, very high. So this idea of equitable access and having the equitable access to social services so important. If education can also be an instrument for building trust across communities by ensuring a greater sort of integration, all the better, but at least to be able to provide equitable access. And this is why, certainly in our work at the Institute and in the book, we suggested a mechanism of what we call national programs. And national programs, not meaning national capital city, but national meaning nationwide or countrywide. How do you have a sense of policy and programming to ensure that embedded within the policies and programs of the country, this principle of equitable access is really embedded? And while, of course, you need the project as the instrument of delivery, because that's how we organize implementation, can it be embedded in that broader programmatic and policy structure that can be communicated much more easily to the broader citizenship, the population? Second, and I've heard you mention this morning, the question of the context of mental health and trauma of the population. I've seen a lot of programming in fragile states in the education sector and other sectors, maybe not the work of the people in this room, but others, making the assumption that we're working in a normal country or a developed country and not understanding those particular needs of the trauma that the country's been through. And I think this is an enormous opportunity to rethink the space and how to build it appropriately into training. I think in Afghanistan maybe there were more, but there was possibly only one trained psychiatrist, psychotherapist back in 2001, and this wasn't seen as an ODA eligible area initially to look at the mental health dynamics, but so important. And I think other areas as well, looking more broadly, and I'll come back to it, the issue of national identity and fostering inclusion across the nation, again, and use of sports for that, for the inclusion of young people. Again, 10 years ago, that wasn't considered an ODA eligible activity to work on sports and so on. Maybe that's changing, but in the category of education, I think all these things are possible. I think the really central challenge is this issue of weak institutions and systems of governance. The pressure to provide social services at scale and rebuild them is absolutely there, because if you don't start investing in the next generation, you're not going to be able to build the institutions, but they're the very constraint as well that you have to face with. And I'll come back to this dilemma, but I think this dilemma is a very, very real one. The pressure is to deliver immediately. So the real temptation is to bypass the state, bypass governance and the institutions and deliver directly to the people. But the more you do that, the more you reinforce a vicious cycle that further undermines those very policies and institutions. So how do you break that cycle? I'll come back to that. But I think we see this across the system. We see this in, whether it's logistics and supply chain management and getting textbooks out, or it's in construction management, it's in accountability in programming for budgets, it's in how procurement works, it's in the very lack of adequately skilled teachers. And I think it often seems, for anyone involved in programming, that all these challenges are simultaneous. And overcoming these constraints is something that's going to take 20 years, yet you have to deliver immediately. So the challenge is a very, very real one. But I think the case that I try to make is that unless we start looking at how the systems and the policies and programs are going to be put in place on a countrywide basis, even if you break it down into urban blocks of units of governance, if we don't start now, the situation's just going to go on getting worse. I think the second challenge seems to be, how do we align education to the needs of industry and government and the broader society? While there are fundamental building blocks of education that may look the same in any context, how do we understand that we're living in a rapidly changing context where, if children are to grow into adults who have a chance in the job market, if they're going to become the public servants of the future, what they're going to need to know has changed. And how do we understand how the curricula need to change, how the way of learning needs to change, so that they're properly committed. And a case that certainly my colleagues and I have been making for a long time, we absolutely, and as a parent, any of us, but as a policy expert, absolutely understand the importance of primary education. But I think we have to balance this with an understanding of, particularly in fragile states, how they also need to invest in their secondary systems, in the vocational and tertiary education systems. And I think I'm beginning to see that enter some of the broader global policy documents. But I must say, and again, while reinforcing the Millennium Development Goals objective of primary education for all was absolutely right, and especially for girls, from what we've seen on the ground, this has in many instances led to a reallocation of resources away from secondary, from vocational and tertiary. And what we're seeing is this is leaving a very worrying gap. My own example, and some of you may have heard this before, but back in 2002, when I was part of or observing the World Bank UN needs assessment for Afghanistan, the delegation said to the Afghan government, the new Afghan government, until every last girl and boy is in primary school, no child in this country will go to secondary school. And the resources were all programmed, with very few exceptions. There was a World Bank grant for some universities. All the resources went to primary education. There was a great back-to-school campaign. Maybe some of you were involved in it. A huge, huge success. We hear these statistics again and again of 8, 9 million kids, 4 million girls back in school. What a fantastic achievement. But what happens to the teenagers? And my fear is maybe we've focused on that demographic, which was absolutely right to do, but the corollary of this over-focus or this neglect of what happens to kids after they're 10 or 11, we've left the teenagers to their own devices. And this has, I think the consequences of that will be very clear. And it's certainly seen, absolutely in a fragile state especially, or post-conflict context, you need to prioritize. But I think we need to adjust these priorities to looking much more holistically at what are the pathways for the teenagers and youth into positions where they can be meaningful stakeholders in society, where they can see what their pathways are to be members, politically engaged in public service, engaged in the labor market, as employees, as entrepreneurs, and engaged as civic actors in their society. And education has such an important role, as is so obvious in that. And I think also from just a pure budget perspective, how much cheaper would it be to invest in secondary education, vocational training, higher education for the next generation in a society than continuing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on importing technical assistance for those very roles? So if a society, whether it's sort of Afghanistan or DRC or Haiti, if they were training their next generation of accountants, of doctors and health workers, of engineers, of auditors, and so on, I think it would be, one could do back-of-the-envelope calculations, which we've done, a far cheaper collective investment than continuing to rely on this very expensive technical assistance industry. Technical assistance industries are still needed in key positions, but not on the scale that many countries have been relying on. Another theme and a particular challenge, I heard the theme of country ownership come up. Absolutely critical. How do what we're doing from the outside, aid agencies, critically USAID, other partners, have an enormous role to play. They have the resources, the wherewithal, the expertise, the experience, the heft through implementing partners. But how do we ensure that those programs and projects are appropriately embedded within a real sense of national country ownership of those education policies? And I think we've all heard stories, I don't need to bring any more up here, of schools being built, programs being started, but the ministry sometimes not even knowing about them, knowing where the schools are going to be built. And then, a school may be built, but why would a ministry then have ownership in making sure that exams are supplied, that teachers are allocated, and so on? So how do we ensure that better alignment? And in many cases, that country ownership will be a challenge. It'll be difficult. Governments may come, there may be a high turnover of ministries, of governments. There may be, in a crisis situation, ministers may be in their teams, may be very busy responding to crises. So doing that forward planning that's necessary is a challenge. We calculated at one point that at least 70 to 80% of a cabinet's time, and we looked at South Sudan and many of these other countries, sort of 70, 80% is spent on crisis management. So yes, it's very hard to think about this foresight and advanced planning, but again, it must be done. And perhaps even more broadly than just a minister and a ministry team, how do you get a sort of broader sense of ownership by looking at domestic think tanks, other stakeholders, so you build up much more of a stakeholder sense of the policies of the education, policies and programs of the education sector. Moving on now to more optimistically to opportunities. I think if the human capital investments are aligned appropriately to the growth potential of the country, to the public sector needs, to the societal needs, that's really your basis for peace and prosperity. And I think there's a real opportunity with education, not only for its own sake, but building a consensus on it within societies. From what I've heard and being a witness in the early Loya Jirgas in Afghanistan, every district leader who stood up were also parents, and what they put first in terms of what they wanted was education for their kids. They'd understand it. So real basis for building ever more consensus on the centrality of education. I think there are also, and I think that's perhaps what this initiative will be doing, to think out of the box and getting beyond, while building school buildings is very, very important in so many parts of the world, they don't need the school building. The really important part is the teacher and the quality of the teacher. Not to say that building buildings and providing desks and the sort of infrastructure of schools isn't important, but I think we have to look at what is actually happening, how is education able to be delivered, and what are the best ways to support that. The role of technology, which I saw is also very much part of the conversation. How can technology appropriately be used in the education sector in general? And obviously this is an area of much innovation and study and thought at the moment, and some controversy. I mean, I think we've seen even in US universities who are trying to introduce a lot of technologies and the use of MOOCs, it's extremely controversial. So I don't think it's going to be easy to see, there's going to be the same controversies. I think we also have to understand, as I'm sure you all do, that there are a lot of vested interests in the education sector. I'm not sure if Transparency International has ever done a study of corruption in the education sector, but I think if they do, I'm not sure how well it would compare even to defense and construction industries if we just look at whether it's the vested interest in textbook printing and distribution and so on. So here, I think technology has such an opportunity to be disruptive, but there's certainly going to be pushback. And I think learning from different pilots about how it can be used, how it is being used, where can it be scaled, an enormous opportunity. And then finally, opportunities to learn from how other countries have successfully built their education systems after conflict and disruption. And I think the opportunity to do more of that, understand the stories of what has worked, how countries have overcome this, how leaders from countries have been agents of bringing better policies and programs to their own countries and societies, what type of programs worked. The more we can study those examples, document those examples, share those examples, and facilitate sharing of those examples amongst countries and societies, the better. Certainly my conversations with a representative from Nigeria this morning, the enormous appetite is to learn from other countries that are facing similar problems, and understanding, having the conversation so that they can learn from each other and have those spaces for frank discussion and sharing. Then, before I go on, just a couple of minutes then on the public sector, the private sector, and the civic sector. When we look at secondary, vocational, tertiary education, I think we have to do a much better job at aligning what kids have been taught to the real needs of the society. And if we look at countries that rebuilt themselves decades ago, so you look at Japan after World War II, we look at South Korea, Singapore, they really started, in a sense, at the final end. They worked out how many engineers do we need, how many accountants, how many bricklayers across the different things, worked out how many do we need. They went and sent people off for training, understanding it may take 3 to 5 years. They came back and they became the next generation of train the trainers while you were growing up your primary education at the other end. But they were thinking about how to gear the education system really to provide what the country needed so they could be self-sufficient. And again, I think that will help reduce the costs in the long term so that the society doesn't need to rely so much on the hundreds of millions of dollars of technical assistance. So the case for investment in this, I think, could be very strong. Second, then, alignment to the private sector needs, where doing some foresight thinking. Some people have said, don't bring us the manpower planning back from the 1970s, but I think short of that, really understanding, and a number of countries are beginning to do this, really think about where are the jobs going to come from, where are the livelihoods going to come from, what in 5 and 10 years' time, and try to align that anticipation of the labor market with the type of skills that the children are going to be learning. And then finally, the relationship of education to peace building and to citizenship and the civic sense. My own experience of interacting with the school, some of you may be familiar with the Marifat School in Kabul, absolutely central to the school and its curriculum is the question of citizenship and identity, and not just the rights of citizenship, but the responsibilities of citizenship to the community, to building peace, to overcoming differences, to enhancing tolerance. And I think especially in the context that we're talking about, where security is really an issue, that building this, and it may be controversial, but building these kind of the civic dimension into the curriculum, but into the life of the school, can play an enormous role. I'll move on. I think this question is one we're very, very familiar with, the process of alignment of these different components, but how do we think systemically across, especially in so often in the education sector, we see in so many countries, the ministry has maybe 100, maybe 200, maybe up to 1,000 different fragmented projects. So how do we move, again, we need projects, but how do we move to embed projects within programs, within policies, and within systems thinking? This is very old hat in the development community, the issue of swaps and so on. But how do we think about that alignment? And I think also, how do we get a better understanding, and this applies across the factors of governance, to the question of understanding which level should which function be provided. And I think often we see in a country's political discourse, decentralization or federalism goes in and out of practice, in and out of fashion. And sometimes, I know in Nepal at the moment, in Somalia at the moment, in Yemen until recently, the answer was seen in decentralization or federalism. But I think in the education sector, as others, you're not going to decentralize all the functions in the education system. Some decisions maybe need to be taken in the school and very locally, but others are going to remain central functions. And how do we come up with a much more nuanced understanding of what decentralization means in practice, and how to disaggregate the different elements that you may decentralize, whether it's the financial aspects, the construction decisions, the oversight, the supervision, the decisions on curriculum, and so on, so that we can have that much more nuanced discussion. Finally, I thought I would close with reflecting on just these central dilemmas. How do we balance the requirements of short-term delivery with this long-term system building? And I don't think there are easy answers here. But I think we need to begin the conversation and to understand this dilemma and this tension at the heart of the programs, the policies, and the plans that are developed. I think it's often seen as a false choice that either you work with government or you work independently and outside. But I think it needs to be brought into a common framework and really negotiated and agreed, what can be, and if it's delivering education in the context of refugee camps, there will be emergency conditions where working outside government is going to be necessary. But how do we always have an eye to thinking about the longer-term legitimacy requirements? That really the central factor in stability, I think in most, if not all of these cases, is going to be establishing the local level legitimacy of the state, of the government, rebuilding that relationship between citizen and state. And so allowing the space, even in these very difficult contexts, for the government to play that right and proper role of policy formulation, of policy supervision. We can't afford to undermine it. And so always looking for opportunities for how we can better embed what we do from the outside with what the requirements are from within to establish that political legitimacy. I'll stop there and would really welcome your comments or your questions.
We can take a couple of questions.
I guess I'll just stand up so you can hear me. You mentioned about teenagers and the need to think about youth and the need to tie what you do with them to the economy. And I wonder if, in the context of many of the fragile states we work in, where economies are just as disrupted as the political system, if we have to think very differently about and out of the box about what we mean by providing relevant skills and where that's going to lead to. Just want you to comment on that.
Another question? Yes.
Yeah, I always, I've been struck always by or frustrated over the last 15 years of this sort of need of either sort of a development focus and investing in ministries and governments, or this humanitarian focus where we do direct service delivery. And I feel like over the years, like if there's one lesson we've learned, that putting your eggs in one basket, whether it's putting it all in sort of institutions when we know strong governments with strong institutions can perpetrate even more effectively state-sponsored violence, you know, where we know there's political will issues and capacity issues in trying to host hundreds of thousands of refugees, sort of, it's not helpful. Or saying, you know, just humanitarian and not. So I know, like South Sudan, we know that you need both. We know that one constant is communities, and that they sustain education services when the government collapses and the services are disrupted. And so just to emphasize this point that it's just not helpful to have that either or, and that it's not helpful to assume anymore that there's such a thing as a clear description of a period of stabilization or a period of early recovery. That's too simple to say, okay, now we're going to use our development model and talk about legitimacy and reestablishing services as if now there's a clear period of stabilization and not pockets of insurgency and governments that are unpopular and still active violence. And what does it mean when you're sort of investing in that kind of system? So I think we just need to get out of that either or and just sort of talk about the and. Maybe we'll
Certainly, and I think, yes, both brilliant questions born evidently from a lot of experience. Absolutely, the economy itself, for anyone who reads the political economy of a country, is often as riven with illegitimacy and corruption and disruption as the government itself. For any country that's coming out of a war economy, those interests are going to be dominating. So it's not a simple question of that there's a legitimate economy waiting to absorb the labor force. And I think exactly understanding that context is incredibly important. I think more generally in development economics in post, there's a lot of work to be done to understand the economy as a terrain of illegitimate interests. And the longer term challenge to build a legitimate economy is going to take 10 and 20 years. And I think that time frame of those countries that have rebuilt legitimate institutions in the economy and in the public sector, as the WDR pointed out in 2011, this is a 20 to 30 year proposition. So understanding the time frames, but I do think, and I think thinking outside of the box, absolutely. And I think there are some organizations like Education for Employment working in the Middle East and other organizations that are doing some really innovative work and thinking in this area, but certainly a need for more. And if there's scope within your program to bring together people to brainstorm this and leaders from countries who've tried to address it, I think that's really key. I do think, however, there's some core work that's pretty low-hanging fruit to be done. If you take Afghanistan, for example, yes, the mining, the oil and the gas sectors are going to take 20 years to develop. But actually the oil and gas is flowing now. But are there even 100 or 200 oil, gas, mining engineers and experts who are trained from the country itself? No, so the country's flying in extremely expensive technical assistance to do things that really should be done by engineers who've been trained in the country. The same with accountants, the same with project managers. I think there's a core set of skills that's so critical to the future of the country. No, it's not going to employ 4 million people, but there's a core set of skills that the country is going to need. We're training up the next generation, including with this commitment to public service that can really nurture that sense of integrity and honesty in public service, absolutely critical. Then more broadly for the jobs that will be provided at scale, then yes, absolutely, it'll need more out-of-the-box thinking, but some kind of alignment. I think it was Jordan who heavily invested in IT skills, but then the IT industry didn't take off and they trained too many IT engineers. But had they got enough teachers? Had they got enough health workers? So where the jobs are provided at scale, including in the teaching and the health systems, is there at least a rough sense of, is the country making the right kind of investments, or do there need to be adjustments? And then I think beyond that, there's, I'm sure, a lot of out-of-the-box thinking that can be done and should be done. I fully agree, I think we need to get out of this either-or thinking and understand that there are going to be, in one context, sometimes where that immediate humanitarian-type recovery response is needed, but there aren't going to be both also your point that the time phasing may not be clear-cut. We're not going to see a period of recovery and then a period of development. We're going to see mixed pictures and 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So there's simultaneity of approaches and understanding the linkages between them really critical. And I think, as you say, a lot of it is going to be at the community level. And how do the communities play their role in organizing education and supervising education and being part of education as in the other social services that are needed. And there will be times, very tragically, when they need to be providing it themselves without the linkages, but then are we at least building the linkages so that it can connect to broader national policy when necessary? And have we created those frameworks that allow that interconnection when necessary?
Seem very unique about education in crisis-affected areas is the severe amount of trauma that kids go through, especially when the crisis is due to sustained political ethnic violence. There's special trauma that impacts learning. What are the unique ways that you deal with that? And then the other thing is that there's often a lack of physical infrastructure for kids. How do you uniquely use informal learning tools to address a lack of infrastructure? If you wait and try to build the infrastructure, you might lose another 2 years worth of kids that you're not teaching.
I think 2 great questions. On the question of trauma, this isn't, I'm not professionally qualified in this area, so maybe I put that back to this program. You guys should figure out the answer to that. I'm sure there's a lot of experience around the world, and how do we learn from what's already being tried, or is there a gap? And I think actually bringing in the psychiatry, psychology, mental health community, and I think there's a lot of interest to do that. I know of a program up at New York that's trying to be doing this, but they haven't yet found people on the development side interested in talking with them, for example. So I think there's potentially a lot of bridges to be built between the trauma response community and the education community to explore this further with the appropriate sort of research and studies. Just from what I've seen, the case of the boarding school that I know of girls, they've learned very quickly that they actually need to bring counselors on staff, because what the girls have been through is beyond the capacity of what a regular teacher can deal with. And they found that the girls have been there 2 or 3 years, and then these stories start coming out. They're in a safe and trusted environment. They begin to bring their stories, but the teachers don't know what to do with that or how to handle that. And they've realized they actually need the professional capacity. They need to be trained in how to respond, how to be a support to the children and help them to overcome what they've been through. So I think certainly it seems to be something that needs to be built much more centrally into the curriculum. And maybe, of course, what I've learned from the other school, Marifat, is that using the families and the community as really part of the school, and helping the parents and the families also to become instruments of taking care of the children and giving them the tools is also very much part of it, and for sustainability purposes is probably needed. On the physical infrastructure, I think the first step is just to recognize that we don't need to wait in particular communities until construction is completed, till the children can come to school and work. So that's the very first step. I've heard again and again across communities that I think it's Nada Nadari, who's one of the great youth leaders, civic leaders of Afghanistan, who's been on the Human Rights Commission. He always says, when he speaks about it, he said his schooling was just under a tent. And he's one of the most articulate and educated people I've met. So I think it's a false assumption to think, while the buildings might be important in the long run, it's an imagined constraint to think that education can't happen without it, and to really think about what without, short of the infrastructure, what does need to be in place. I think it's most essentially, it's the human capital of the teacher and the organization that's really central. So putting the investment into that, into training the teachers, into supporting them with what they need to be effective, really critical. And then maybe some use of technology as well. But if you don't have infrastructure, do you have power that can enable the technology? It has to be very carefully thought about. But I think it's the right question to be asking.
I think we're going to have to bring this to a close. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you for, I mean, we have all our challenges laid out in front of us, external challenges, internal challenges, and that's what we're here to address. So thank you, Claire.